Okay. Can you see a PowerPoint called Building Better Men coming up?
Yes, although it's still loading.
Okay, well, it's loading for me too. Okay. So let's continue our unit today on gender and gender psychology. Okay. So there's an article that I turned into a PowerPoint called Building Better Men, and it's an article written by Jacqueline Friedman. She is feminist, author, advocate, activist, etc. And in the beginning of the article, you notice that she shares a story of her friend Dave. So when she and Dave meet, they are friends. You know, Dave's married, kids. They are at dinner parties and social activities together. And after a couple of years, Dave tearfully confesses to Jacqueline that Dave is a rapist. And he did not know that when he was a rapist, that what he was doing was rape. And he describes his MO to Jacqueline, which she knows is a standard modus operandi, meaning a standard method by which he would rape women. So what he would do is he would get a young lady alone, listen to her deeply, prompt her to share her vulnerability so she felt very safe with him, and he would ply her with alcohol, is the old school phrase, or the way we would say it today, get her drunk. And so as soon as she starts passing out, he would, quote, have sex with her, unquote. And Dave came to realize rape, that this is sexual assault. And this is too common a story. The average rapist with this particular modus operandi rapes 6 women, okay? So some as few as 1, but some as many as 12. 6 is just an average. And so Jacqueline's assumption before she met Dave is that all men who engage in rape behaviors are sociopaths. However, being friends with Dave and knowing Dave and caring for Dave as a friend and seeing that he's not sociopathic, she realized that this is not the case. She wondered if instead men rape because of their culturally based understanding of masculinity, what masculinity is and what it means. And so she spends the rest of the article wondering about this out loud and what can be done about it. So one of the things that Jacqueline does is she goes through and she is doing her research as a journalist. In fact, one of the things that I kind of chuckle at is there are some research studies that in my little group, we end up having to collaborate with journalism students to get some studies done because the rules and regulations over journalism research is pretty different than over psychological research, and the truth claims are very different in journalism than they are in psychology. So it's been neat learning how journalists do it. For example, a journalist can do this. They can talk to their friends. They can survey their friends about what masculinities they would like to see valued and portrayed more often. So which types of masculine beings should be put in the forefront of our popular culture and celebrated more frequently. And so the list included Frank Ocean. So the reason why, according to her friends, is Frank Ocean sings about and talks about vulnerability and around sexual intimacy and sexuality generally. That Frank Ocean has a very touching way, according to many Jacqueline's friends, about talking about romantic feelings and being very raw and honest with his feelings. In fact, I kind of chuckled because in my psychology of heavy metal class, this third week, Leilani, do you remember, was the second or third week somebody shared a Frank Ocean song in psychology of heavy metal?
I think it was the week before last, so
it would have been week 2.
Yeah, I think so.
But I don't know if you'll agree with me, Leilani. I thought that although the song didn't end up on my playlist, I got why the students submitted it because it was a very raw emotion, right? And that's what heavy metal is known for, is deeply raw emotionality. So I'm like, okay, fits with the class. And I did appreciate some of the messages shared in that particular song. So Steph Curry apparently is a sports ball star and is a very caring and doting father that whether on camera or off camera, he seems to take very good care of his daughter. He seems to be very appropriately loving and supportive of her. Barack Obama For those of you who know President Obama, demonstrated very careful, caring, and playful interactions with his children. And by by all accounts of those who lived in the White House, he was very supportive and loving of his wife, and very supportive and loving of his daughters. And so showed a side of masculinity we don't often get to see. Bob from Bob's Burgers. This is a TV series I quite liked back when it was on the air, where Bob is a man doing his best to take care of his family, and is very open about how he feels and how he's doing. He doesn't put his wife or kids down. He's doing his best to help them, and succeeds in varying degrees throughout the series. So there are superheroes like Flash. Now, I'm very familiar with Flash. What caught my eye was, I don't know this other hero called Midnighter. I'm wondering if I'm going to lose my comic book geek cred right here. But apparently, like in the Flash, he's very kind, he's very respectful, he does what he can for people. He shows that even in the face of getting pushback, or his vulnerabilities being his emotional vulnerabilities being taken advantage over, that's how he's harmed. He persists on being a very kind and caring person. It reminds me of many, but not all, depictions of Spider-Man, where Spider-Man remains very kind and caring to people, even though his kindness and caring are sometimes the source of his emotional injuries. Now, the queer guys from Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, that there are ways of embodying manhood amongst those particular players that might be very helpful for many other people to see, hear, and understand, maybe even adopt as values. So Jacqueline goes on to talk about toxic manhood. She asserts that there are other types of masculinity that she deems toxic. She highlights President Trump's embodiment of masculinity. And she goes through, and not just here, but in other articles that she writes, she breaks down quotes, tweets, etc. from Trump. She doesn't take them out of context. She takes them in context, and shows that manliness for Trump is opposition to women that he degrades and denigrates. So she gives the example: he's been accused of sexual assault by well over a dozen women. He and his colleagues strive for a reestablishment of traditional gender values. Now, I don't know that Trump himself really cares about that. It seems, reading his his writings and listening to his public statements and reading his tweets, that upholding gender values is a way to get votes, not necessarily that he himself believes it. Regardless, he does very much believe that men are dominant and women are subservient. And then some of his followers, some of his colleagues, argue that anyone who questions this natural order is a problem, that they have aberrant or obscene values. So many men are raised in homes that reflect these values. Dad does what he wants, mother capitulates, or there is either aggression or passive aggression towards her. That the assumption that dad is in charge. And I kind of wince at something. I'm going to go on a tangent here. I kind of wince at something because I was raised in a very conservative home. My father was an educator for the Latter-day Saint Church. My mother had 7 biological children, and I don't know how many. We had 1 formal adoptee, and then probably half a dozen or so informal adoptees come and go from our home. These were usually young adults that came and lived with us for a period of time. And, very strict household, a lot of rules. Church was an omnipresent feature. We were grounded on Sundays. We were grounded on Mondays. Sundays because it was a day of rest. So you didn't do anything other than pray. For me, nap and daydream. But that was the ideal. And then Mondays you weren't allowed out after school because you didn't do anything to interfere with family home evening. And then Wednesday nights growing up was primary, and so you'd have to go back to church on Wednesdays. So church was omnipresent, and lots of church messages. And so that seems very conservative. My mother, stay-at-home mom, my dad out and working. At the same time, though, it frustrates me that some people believe that these toxic gender roles are conservative. They're not. They're aberrant to conservatives, true conservatives. My father speaks about and to my mother with genuine admiration, affection, and respect, that they team up and they work together to facilitate one another's goals and one another's dreams and one another's points of view. My father would bend heaven and earth for my mother, and she would do the same for him. And so it's interesting that, and that's always been the case. My parents have always been a team, no matter what hell or drama that they were going through. And so it really frustrates me and rankles me a little bit when I see various pundits say, oh, you know, conservative values are toxically masculine or misogynist. And I'm going, I know that some conservative values are, depending on how they're embodied, but there are some deeply conservative people who have deeply conservative gender values who are far more egalitarian than anything I see anywhere else. And so, and there are some who are deeply misogynistic or misandrist, right? So just a little tangent there to keep in mind that, you know, according to certain teachings in Catholicism, evangelism, etc., there is no room for abuse or toxic masculinity, but that's often lost because religion is so often used as a cover for morally aberrant behavior. So I do appreciate, though, what Jacqueline is saying here, because time and time again, I see that in certain households, men assume that they're going to get their way, and that if they don't get their way, then they're either overtly violent, shaming, blaming, etc., or passive aggressive. And passive aggressive could be name calling, withdrawing affection or support. Oftentimes, I call it the pout. You know what it's like when a 3-year-old, like when a toddler pouts? That's a common form of passive aggression that men who presume that they're going to get their way exhibit. Now, some of you are saying, wait, women do this too? You're right, they do. From one thing, learn 10,000 things. Our point, though, is today is we're focusing on masculinity and toxic masculinity, which seems in our culture to be a pretty big problem in certain ways. For example, although we talked earlier in our earlier unit about how women do engage in sexual assault, it is far less common than when men do. So if we're going to take up and wonder about the source of toxicity, we can do so with women at some point, but it seems like the more pressing concern is toxic manhood, toxic masculinity. So that's why we're talking about it today. So how do we grow out of toxic masculinity? Now, I'm very grateful that my father was fierce with me, his son, about treating people as equals and treating people as respectfully, regardless of race or gender or etc., that it was pounded into me. So for those of you that don't know me personally, I'm 6.5 feet tall and I'm a pretty big guy. And Dad said, you are taller that you may see farther, and you are strong that you may lift those whose hands hang down, right? Meaning those who are suffering and sad and everything else. And it doesn't matter who it is, male, female, young, old, black, white, brown, it doesn't matter. You are there to love and serve others. And so that's a very powerful, very conservative value. So I'm very grateful that I didn't have to grow out of toxic masculinity, but not to say it hasn't been a part of my life or that it hasn't been bleeding in the corners. And so encountering the consequences of toxic masculinity can have different effects. So Jacqueline goes on and talks about how encountering, when a rapist encounters those they have harmed in the face of their suffering, it can foster compassion. That I'm just thinking of how many hundreds of stories I've heard through the years as a therapist where she remembers she was at a party, she remembers drinking, and she was with a guy, and she wakes up home in bed. She has no memory how she got home. Her underwear is missing, and she's not sure if she needs to take a Plan B pill. Okay, a Plan B pill, for those of you that don't know, is a way to prevent a pregnancy from taking hold. So if a sperm is connected with an egg, to prevent it from implanting in the uterine wall. So it's a basic way to prevent a pregnancy. And it's usually only good, I think, within 48 hours. Do you know, Leilani? I think it's, you got to take it pretty quick.
It gets less effective over time, but I think I've heard that it can be a little bit more than 48 hours. It's just the chance of it working are smaller.
Okay, because the advice we give our clients at the clinic is 48 hours. And so, thank you, Leilani. I didn't know that. So there is a there is a practice in some prisons called restorative justice. And I've only been able to be a part of this a little bit here and there, but it's where in jails or prisons, the victim meets with their assailant. The victim meets with the offender. And they have a conversation with one or two therapists present about what they each experienced. And it can be a very unfolding event. It's often very anxiety provoking, or anxiety and rage, or just rage provoking for the victim. And then it's very humbling, guilting, shaming, etc. for the offender. And more often than not, the conversation is actually very productive, where I've seen on those rare occasions I've been able to be a part of this, the offender sobbing and the victim sobbing together, and the offender saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. And it's not, I'm sorry you hurt, which is a narcissistic response. Instead, it's, I'm sorry I did that to you. I had no idea it would have this effect on you. So likewise, in the case of a friend of mine, he would engage in these kind of date rape behaviors, because as you all know, rape is far more likely to happen with somebody that you know. Okay, the stranger rape is unfortunately too common, but what is far more common still is acquaintance rape, date rape, etc. And so a colleague of mine, what he was doing to women ended up happening to his sister from another man. And it really changed my colleague's whole perspective on this dynamic. And so some of the outcomes to this is rape jokes stop feeling funny. Like when people tell rape jokes, there's that, ooh, it just like, it's like grabs your spine and wiggles. It's like, oh no, it's not okay. Slut shaming, one of the things that flips slut shaming around is you automatically look at who the partner is. Like I can remember getting in a debate about welfare programs for single moms, making sure that moms had rent support and food for the kids and clothes for the kids and themselves, right? And some of my sundry relations with different points of view started arguing, well, if the women didn't want to be poor, they shouldn't have had kids. And holy cow, there are so many responses to that, and I don't even know where to begin. But one of the things that people have been through this process of being humbled and learning compassion in the face of this realize is, where's the partner? This baby didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like a woman was just walking down the road one day and went, I'm going to have a kid, and just squeezed a kid out right there on the sidewalk. That's not the way it works. Where is the partner? You're saying that she should have thought about it. Why didn't the male partner think of it? Like, why is it that she lives in poverty, but the male partner has a less likelihood of living in poverty? What's going on here? You know what I mean? She didn't make this decision in a vacuum. And then the other thing that happens, and we'll get into this more in a minute, is the ways in which women are all too often acculturated to capitulate to the demands of a man. And one of the things, for those of you that have done victims advocacy and have actually worked with victims of sexual assault, how rarely they say no verbally and out loud because they've been punished to say no so often. Me, Leilani, and Kelly have been working on some exercises. We've been putting each other on I'm sorry restriction. So, when we do every little thing, like I accidentally, drop a little cup on the floor, oh, I'm sorry, to try to learn not to do that, because women are 7 times more likely to start a sentence with I'm sorry than men are. And so it shows how in our society that we're just used to men getting their way. And if men don't get their way, there are consequences. So imagine you're a woman and somebody comes to you and says, well, if you didn't want to be on welfare, you shouldn't have had kids. And you may agree and feel horribly ashamed of yourself. But somebody who's been through this would go, no, none of this is okay. You weren't choosing to have kids when you had sex. What would have been the consequences if you'd said no to your lover? How would you have been beaten? Would he have pouted? Would you have felt horribly guilty because you didn't capitulate to his sexual desires? Like, what would have been the consequences? And some people would say, well, raising a kid until they're 18 is worth the consequence of one night's inconvenience. but we don't know how inconvenient those nights necessarily are. Okay, so there's a lot of things that go into that. Women are no longer experienced as commodities by men who have had this kind of compassionate come to Jesus moment of really experiencing women in the face of such toxic masculinity. Intolerance for such language in their presence, that I've noticed that men who have been through this transformative process don't tolerate the objectification of women when they're around. They don't tolerate rape jokes. They don't tolerate statements like grab her by the pussy. They don't tolerate that kind of language. They don't be around it, and they'll correct it. Okay. They note that access to birth control becomes very important when they realize that I have been a part of sexual assault of women that could have gotten them pregnant. I'm now part of the problem. And that when women have children out of wedlock, it tends to create poverty, and sometimes intergenerational poverty. Birth control becomes very important. Okay. Teaching daughters that their bodies are their own is another common effect. Like, although my background is different than those who have engaged in this kind of toxic masculine background, I appreciate this last point, because so I'm a big man, I'm well armed, I've been taught to shoot from the time I was a young age, and some friends say, oh my gosh, your daughters are so beautiful. Like, when people come to date them, do you meet them at the door with a shotgun and a shovel? And I go, no, I don't stand guard in front of my daughter's genitals. I've taught my daughters that they are worthwhile beings and that they are worthy of love and respect, etc. And they've got their own switchblades and guns. If somebody messes with them, it's on them. My daughters are very capable and know that they are loved and that they are worthy of respect. And sure enough, it's been very rewarding watching my daughters, that when their boyfriends or lover gets disrespectful, my daughters fight back. And if their lovers continue it, the relationship ends. And so I've had, especially one of my daughters here, coming to visit dad to get a big hug because once a guy flipped a Jekyll and Hyde on her. Yeah, I don't need to stand guard in front of my daughter's genitals. Their genitals are their own. I get to teach them that they are worthy of love and respect by loving them and respecting them. So sometimes suffering legal consequences can help. Sometimes, actually learning the magnitude of getting a girl drunk and having sex with her while she's unconscious and going to jail for that is a great way to learn that's wrong. Okay. Sometimes when the perpetrators are not confronted for their rape behaviors, those rape behaviors continue. So I can remember, it's been, seems like just yesterday, but it's probably been about 15 years ago, a colleague of mine was in my office crying. She had been sexually assaulted over the weekend. She went and got a rape kit, etc. And it was she was raped by a friend, and she called the police on her way. She drove herself to the hospital and she called the police, and she called the police for his sake, right? That she wanted him to learn clearly and explicitly that this behavior is not okay and needs to stop. And so that just blew my mind. I'd never, to that point, never heard of somebody calling the police on a friend for the friend's sake, and it worked. Okay, so toxic masculinity and misogyny. Overt hostile sexism, right? When we think of toxic masculinity, this is often what we think about. Calling women degrading names, rape jokes, rape threats. That these people who have these overtly toxic masculine styles are openly dangerous to relate to, and it's not actually the most successful relationship strategy. And what we is called covert hostile sexism. Now, overt hostile sexism is real, it's a problem, we do see it, but covert hostile sexism I see a lot more. So there was a book written in late Victorian era, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So Dr. Jekyll is a chemist, and he's trying to come up with a serum in order to, cure all sorts of maladies, create super soldiers, etc. Whole comic books were later inspired by this, like, Captain America, etc. The Incredible Hulk. So Dr. Jekyll is trying to create this serum, and when he takes the serum, he turns into a monstrous Mr. Hyde, who is a rapist and serial killer. And so benevolent sexism of Dr. Jekyll manifests like this. Real men protect good women. And so when you look very carefully amongst people who say this, the guy behind me is my wife and my daughters, and I got my gun, and you're going to have to come through me to get to them. Sometimes that can be very beneficently inspired and informed. But when we look at who is worthy of protection for some of these men, they're objectified angels living on pedestals where they must remain. They must be sexually pure, unsullied, etc. And if not, then they're not good women anymore. So if a woman falls off the pedestal, she's no longer a good woman and is no longer worthy of protection. And the toxic Mr. Hyde can come out. What's also interesting is that the toxic Mr. Hyde can come out when the angel persists on remaining an angel and Dr. Jekyll wants a slut to sleep with. And so it creates this very interesting Madonna whore complex psychologically that both men and women share. So I hope we'll get into this more later in the semester. If not, we'll talk about it now a little bit. This originates from a study done in a large area of Texas called the Valley. It's southern Texas, southern central Texas. And there were some anthropologists who were doing ethnographic research about the gendered cultures there. And one of the things they found is that many men and women had a Madonna whore complex. What that meant was many of these men wanted their women at home to be the pure saintly Madonnas, the mothers of their kids. The only time that they would have sex with the Madonnas in their homes was with guilt-ridden sex with the lights off for the sake of procreation, that their Madonnas were beautiful and sexually pure, etc., and worth fighting for, a girl worth fighting for, right, to quote Disney. And so at the same time, though, many of these same men would also have their girlfriends. They would have their mistresses on the side that they would have sex with, and everybody understood that it was a tacit dynamic. And unless the man threw his girlfriend in the face of his wife, everything was okay because boys will be boys. Well, in some cultures, like I've noticed local culture, having mistresses is greatly frowned upon. It can cost you jobs, get you kicked out of your church, etc., where that doesn't happen in the largely Catholic culture down in the valley. And so instead, people have this kind of schizophrenia where people with this, covert hostile sexism, they want their wives to both be the Madonna at church, the pure, saintly, celestial temple bride, but then a whore in the bedroom who's sexually rapacious and anything goes sexually and doesn't have any sexual preference that is any way different from her husband's. And so the Madonna whore complex, I've ended up having to do a lot of therapy around that here in this area, because women often feel obligated to somehow be saintly and slutty, and the men desire that their women be saintly and slutty somehow at the same time. And so it can create a lot of heartbreak and a lot of confusion. And what I keep going back to, this is covert hostile sexism. Rather than us being able to be people, whether we're at church, in the office, or at home, and having nurturing mutual relationships where we get to talk about our sexual interests and sexuality with our lover, instead it becomes role taking, that everywhere we go there's a facade we have to put on, and living that inauthentically creates a lot of depression, anxiety, and a lot of misery in relationships. So a common refrain I hear from women who have split up with yet another covert hostile sexist is, I should have known that my lover was going to become an abuser. Sorry, they don't really use the term lover around here. I should have known that my husband, my second husband, was just like my first husband, or this third boyfriend was just like boyfriend 1 or 2, that my lover is abusive. So my response to this is, I've been doing therapy for 25 years and I can't spot them out. I mean, I can spot some tendencies towards sexism, but I think some tendencies towards narcissism, but tendencies are just that. I'm thinking of a couple cousins of mine who have some tendencies towards what seem to be covert hostile sexism. We're extremely good to their wives and daughters, and it's not in a misogynistic way. So if you meet Dr. Jekyll, how can you know that he drinks the toxic masculinity potion that turns him into monstrous Mr. Hyde? We don't know that in advance necessarily. So Karen Chan is a sex educator, and for her it's very important to teach boys about rejection, because the cultural stereotype is that when boys want sex, they just want sex and that's it. And yeah, that does happen sometimes. In a lot of the time, it is sublimated touch. It is sublimated crave for intimacy, for contact. And so one of the things so when a boy's sexual advances are rejected, that's when we see a lot of the covert toxic masculinity come out. He's nice, he's sexually rejected, and then he's an asshole, okay? and so they don't handle rejection well. When it's not rejection sometimes, a lot of the times it's timing. I mean, sometimes you're right, it is straight up rejection, but other times it's, imagine you've been dating somebody for a while and you're in a mood and they're not, and you're like, actually not tonight, honey, I've just got this and this going on, and they get all butthurt when tomorrow night it could have been, hell yes, let's do this. Let's plan a great evening with one another. So so it's experiences rejection of the being, right? That these disproportionate, although it happens with girls too, it's disproportionately common for boys to react violently or inappropriate around that rejection, whereas women may act inappropriately but not necessarily violently. So she asks, how might we empathize with a young guy who is balancing masculinity pressures and the desire to show and receive love, right? How can we help him experience bearable rejection instead of unbearable failure? Like, how can we start rewriting these internal cultural scripts, these covert scripts about emotion and about making bids for attention, intimate attention? And so those are some great important questions. And so one of the things that Chan highlights is that many education programs around these issues of helping change unbearable failure into bearable rejection, is that they're often in college-based programs. She says that seems to be too late. Middle school is actually a better time, especially around 5th to 6th grade. In her experience as a sex educator, high school, it's like too many toxic masculine models have been interjected for there to be as much movement as when you get to boys younger. So there's a program called Maine Boys to Men, which Jacqueline highlights as an example. So what they do is they begin, in fact, they're a mixed sex group. One of the cool things about Maine Boys to Men is that boys and girls are a part of this education program because of the important observation that boys and girls both participate in masculinity, just like boys and girls participate in femininity. And so what they do is they begin by teaching a gender box, and all the stereotypes of masculinity go in the box, okay? Money, strength, stoic, everything else goes into that. So promiscuous, right? Provide, protect, procreate, and the toxic manifestations of that, the problematic manifestations of that. And then what they do, the educator in the front of the room then writes on the outside of the box all of the consequences when people behave differently than these masculine stereotypes, okay? So the various punishments: social rejection, getting beat up, getting called names, being deprived of opportunity. Certain girls are less interested in dating you, etc. So boys are given exercises about what they believe about topics relating to sexism and gender, and they're also given empathy training, and then they're put in discussion groups with their mixed sex peers. So the teens in the Maine Boys to Men program are hand-selected for their tendency to stand out among their peers, meaning that the educators go in and they don't look at who the teachers like, they look at who the students pay attention to. So which student do the other students pay attention to? And those people are brought into the program, male and female. That if they are educated, these boys and girls are educated, then it tends to, quote unquote, inoculate the whole school, like like a measles shot or something, you know what I mean? That it's a way to spread the influence far more so than when you try to teach the teachers. I was just thinking of my kids' experiences and the reports that I hear is that oftentimes teachers are a part of traditional sexism. And some of the quotes coming from the teachers that come to my ears are a little, oh, they said that, did they? Okay. Telling my daughter that in one of her classes that it is her job to find a good man when my daughter's a lesbian. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, okay, or she identifies as a lesbian. So there's an exercise, there's a whole bunch of things that Maine Boys to Men do, but I just wanted to share one exercise. They stand on a continuum if the scenario is presented is consensual or assault. So imagine you have a line drawn across the back of a room and everybody is gathered up by the educator. Then as the educator starts sharing parts of a story, people go and line up on a line as to whether or not this is trending in the direction of consent or assault. And so as the story unfolds, then the students can move on towards the assault line of the wall, which is clearly marked, or the consent side of the wall, which is clearly marked. Okay, so here's one of the stories they share. So Bree and Ben are at prom night. They've just finished the dance. As Ben is leaving the dance, he pulls down an alley after, unsure of what's going on. Bree is pretending to fall asleep on the passenger side of the car. Ben leans over and proceeds to kiss her neck and grope her breasts. She pushes him away, and he persists. In this scenario, there's a typo. Many girls argue it wasn't assault because she didn't say no. And so, whereas the boys, interestingly enough, are more likely in this particular scenario to see it as assault than girls are in the Maine Boys to Men program. And the answer is, well, like when the educators follow up on this, go, oh, because she didn't say no. And so the educators then break down the scenario and they revisit their empathy training, and then they go through the scenario again with their empathy training in mind. Like, they'll encourage the boys to point out to one another and to the girls that her trying to fall asleep was trying to avoid the kind of attention. Like, she was scared. She didn't know what was going to happen. And so the groping and the kind of, no, I don't want this, even though she didn't say no out loud, she tried to push him away. That was no, right? That is a behavioral no. And so how to look for that and recognize that. And for the girls who do it, to recognize that as that is a valuable and important way of saying no. And so, not to say that words aren't important, but actions are also important. And so by revisiting it with empathy training and asking the boys and girls, what is Bree experiencing when this is happening? What might she be experiencing, given that she was trying to fall asleep and she's leaning to the far side of the car and trying to push him away? Then what might be happening there? And so it helps people learn empathy. So the Maine Boys to Men program seems remarkably effective when offered in a timely way. Now, it is unlike what Karen Chan recommends. The Maine Boys to Men program is often oriented towards high school students and college students. There's no reason they couldn't do this with junior high kids, right? And so Karen Chan would say, hey, get me involved and let's keep doing it for 10th, 11th, and 12th, but let's also start at 5th grade and see if we can have a better effect early on with these boys and girls. Okay, so if you want to go ahead and read the article, it's under Unit 3, I think, under Files, along with this PowerPoint if you want to review it. And so I wish you all were here so we could sit and talk about this. Usually when I talk about this, it ends up being a 2-day long discussion. Let me, as we're closing up the unit on masculinities and femininities, there's a piece that I keep outlining and erasing the outline and re-outlining, and it's a piece entitled What We Lost When John Wayne Died, Revisiting the Traditional American Male. Because oftentimes the John Wayne archetype is held up as like toxic masculinity in its most raw form. And on the one hand, I think that archetype, the John Wayne archetype, is worthy of critique, and I think it's important for us to do so. At the same time, though, I've noticed some authors throw that baby out with the bathwater. So one of the virtues or characteristics of the John Wayne archetype is emotional stoicism in the face of crisis. So on the one hand, that if you're a child crying and you're met with stoicism, that's not very healthy. It's much more important to be met with tenderness and compassion rather than emotional standoffishness. At the same time, though, emotional stoicism can be very powerful and very helpful. So I was raised in very much a, grilling out on the back porch, 6 guns on your hip, God and country kind of culture, and I'm very grateful that I was. Not to say that any given subculture doesn't have its limitations, of course they do. But one of the things that I really appreciate is the ability to stand up when you hurt, even though you keep taking shots to the chin by those who are doing unjust things, right? That the stoicism, the emotional fortitude and welfare. that in a crisis, would you rather have somebody who melts down with you when you're bleeding to death? They just start screaming, your blood, I'm so sorry. Or do you want somebody who stoically applies a tourniquet and first aid and gets you to the hospital, right? And so another one is the use of violence, and that's one that's seen as huge. Well, that is deeply important. But at the same time, though, how many shots to the chin have I taken through the years by standing up against rape, by standing up against misogyny and racism, etc.? I'm going to keep taking those shots to the chin. And it's because of the John Wayne lifestyle that I was raised in that I'm going to do that. The other is respect. John Wayne was never disrespectful to women. Now, granted, the archetype presumes stereotypified traditional male and female gender roles. But at the same time, if you look at the movies, who John Wayne felt most captivated by were the women who were very much themselves and doing their own thing. Right? So there's a lot of ways in which when we demean a stereotype, we also lose the benefit of that particular stereotype. So the way I raise my kids, they learn to shoot at a young age, speak respectfully, love and care for all, to both share their feelings appropriately and to be nurtured in the face of those, as well as to stand up when it's important to stand up and fight for what's right. How to keep moving even though we're depressed or sad or hurting, because other people need us, as well as to ask for help while we do that. All of those things come from a masculine stereotype that has been deeply denigrated for both fair and unfair reasons. So I'll probably write the outline again here soon and erase it again, because there's a lot of things I want to say, and I don't know if I can just say them in a paper. Plus, I don't think anybody would want to publish an academic paper like that, because stereotypes and bias aren't limited to your friends on Facebook, right? Stereotypes and bias are most fully magnified amongst academics like myself. Okay, so thank you all very much for your time today. And, Leilani, are we moving on to Unit 4 next?
Yes, I think so. And then also, just for anyone who might ever need this information, I Googled it, and the Plan B pill is actually effective for up to 5 days after having sex, but it's most effective within the first 72 hours.
Oh, 72. So we were being
Mhm.
really careful by saying 48. So up to 5 days, 72 hours. And how does one get a Plan B pill?
I think any pharmacy has it. If you just go up to the counter, they'll give it to you.
And sometimes Planned Parenthood can also help. Sometimes they have some there too. So thank you for looking that up for us, Leilani. I appreciate it. Okay, bye-bye, everybody. I will see you on Wednesday. I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about. I think we're going to start breaking into our unit on love and loving, because I don't think we've done that yet this semester, have we, Leilani?
We have not.
Okay, so we'll talk about the types of love and loving, and then we'll get into does sex necessarily complicate everything between friends? So I'll share various perspectives on that. So we will see you all later. Bye-bye now.